Well, good afternoon and welcome to everyone. On behalf of the RCI IBEC Foundation, we're pleased that you've chosen to join us. This is a very important event and we're pleased to have you. I'm Sid Hankins. I'm a board member on the foundation and I'm excited about what we're presenting today. First, we have to take care of some bookkeeping. We have to read Article 21. So if you'll give me just a moment here. Section 1, jurisdiction. These policies and procedures apply to all meetings of the membership, board, committee, and other meetings sponsored by IBEC. All meetings attended by representatives of IBEC and to IBEC's employees and all of their activities within the scope of their employment. Section 2, discussions of prices or price levels are prohibited. In addition, no discussion is permitted of any elements of a company's operations which might influence price. It is a violation of the antitrust laws to agree not to compete. Therefore, discussions of divisions of territories or customers or of limitations on the nature of business carried on or products sold are not permitted. Boycotts in any form are unlawful. Discussion relating to boycotts is prohibited, including discussions about unfavorable reports about particular companies, including their financial situation. Okay, I know that many of you are familiar with the IBEC Foundation, but I'd like to give you just a little background about how we reached the point where we are today. The Foundation's mission is to support research, education, and the dissemination of information for issues important to the building enclosure industry. The foundation was started in 2001, and since that time, we have received more than $3 million in donations that we've used for research, educational programs, publications, and student scholarships. Also, there is a partner organization, RCI Foundation Canada, which parallels RCI IBEC Foundation, and the two organizations share the same goals and work in concert with each other. The late Joe Hale was the driving force behind the foundation, and I'm sure he would be pleased with what we're going to do today. So as design professionals or manufacturers, sales reps, or consultants, many of you no doubt have encountered various methods of procurement. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. It seems that every state or city or county or school board or building authority have their own unique form of soliciting and awarding contracts. And the federal government, as you may know, and all of their departments and agencies for decades have used purchasing schedules, emergency acquisitions, best values, and low bids to acquire goods and services. Originally, RCI's involvement with procurement began with our reaction to isolated incidents, primarily brought to our attention by individual members. We went to Florida to be involved in building code issues. We went to Virginia to be involved in soliciting professional services. And it became evident that RCI must serve its members by becoming an outspoken voice for members' rights and an advocate for the building enclosure industry. RCI established an advocacy committee in 2007 as its first official step in that direction. The committee's goals remain now as they were first established, and I'd like to list those or read those to you because you're going to hear about them a little bit later in the presentation this afternoon. Enhance the value of RCI IBEC for members and non-members. Promote responsible practices that benefit clients. Improve opportunities for workforce development and public awareness through enhanced educational research. influence the development and reform of laws, regulations, and standards, and support RCI IBEC consultant members in their business practices. So RCI soon realized that for the benefit of our members, a full-time effort would be required to monitor and to influence a wide range of professional activities, including procurement. In 2018, Brian Gardner was appointed the RCI Director of Industry Affairs. Many of you know Brian. He was a longtime member of RCI and had a very successful consulting practice. And for years, he had been the voice for equitable procurement practices in the state of Texas and legislation that came before the legislature there. He retired from practice to head an advocacy effort that became RCI's first full-time commitment to procurement reform. And in his not so subtle ways, if you know Brian, he was the first to encourage the foundation to invest in intensive nationwide research into procurement. Brian's a good friend, and we owe him a debt of gratitude for his contributions. I hope he is watching today. But let's get on to the main reason for today's session. Today is the culmination of many months and many hours of research, interviews, and surveys. So we are excited to announce the release of an important publication. Its title is An Analysis of Unit Price Procurement, and we believe that it is a landmark study of how contracts for public work are awarded. In the fall of 2019, the foundation received a proposal and a request for a research grant to study unit price procurement. The authors were Dr. Paul Chanowski. He was a professor emeritus in the Civil, Environmental, Architectural Engineering Department at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and Dr. Gordon Kingsley, an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. They had previously completed a study on qualifications-based selection, QBS, if any of you are familiar with the acronym. And since that time, they found that the issues and the concerns that had prompted that initial study were now appearing similarly in other procurement methods, most notably the increased use of unit price costing. As I said, the foundation is focused primarily on supporting the activities that advance the knowledge of the building enclosure industry. And considering the years-long involvement with various procurement issues, the foundation realized this was an opportunity to develop a deeper understanding of unit price procurement. A broad-based study had long been needed for the benefit, not just for consultants, but for the entire building enclosure. So without any further delay, it is my privilege now to turn the program over and to introduce Dr. Paul Chanowski. And as a reminder, any questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. So please use the chat box to submit those questions. Paul, it's all yours.
There we go. All right. Thanks, Ed. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is great to be able to talk about this study. It was a great opportunity to look at a very complex question that unit price procurement doesn't always mean the same thing in every location. So what we did in this study was really try and come up with what is the state of this? What's going on? What is it that is potentially problematic? And then what has to be done about it? So I'm going to talk about what we found, what are the key issues that we found, before turning it over to Brian, who's going to talk about what's coming next, what IBEC's looking at. So let me share my screen here. And I'm going to spend about the next 15 minutes talking about really what was at the core of this, and encourage everyone to read the entire report as it goes into even additional detail. So, all right. So as I said, this study was done in conjunction with Professor Gordon Kingsley from Georgia Tech, who's on the public administration side. Combination of mine and the engineering side. Gordon's in public administration really gave us kind of a look at not only what, but why things are occurring. So let's jump into this. There we go. All right. So the top line issues that we found out about, really, you can talk about four things came out of what we did. Access and qualification. Significant concerns about, is unit price procurement equitable in the practices, the way it's being put in place? And I'm going to talk about all these in more depth over the next 10 minutes or so. National pricing practices. This is probably the core of what is the most controversial in this. The advertised benefits that people put as to why they're bringing in cooperative purchasing agreements, unit price procurement, really just aren't true. Independent professional oversight. Engineering, as you all know, and any type of public infrastructure is dependent on a professional ensuring that life safety has been addressed. There are significant concerns because of the lack of independent professional oversight in many situations. And finally, a challenge that is been talked about almost universally across the country, building code inconsistency. As long as we have inconsistencies in every jurisdiction having different rules, we're creating loopholes where we don't have to actually have professionals involved. So how did we go about this? We really took a three-part approach. Part one was doing extensive literature review, which I'll talk about in just a second, even a little bit more. Two, understanding cases. What has happened in the past? Successes, failures, controversies. What has it been that's made this an issue that has become increasingly important? And the third part, interviews. The heart of this study was interviews that covered geographic regions all across the country. It included suppliers, owners, engineers, consultants, really looking at in depth, what are the issues that we're talking about? So I talked about very beginning, one of the things that makes this a complex topic is it almost means different things in different areas. In fact, when you take an in-depth look across studies that have been done on this, how people advertise and talk about unit price, you find out there's a geographic issue. Not all geographic jurisdictions have the same issues. It's a legal issue. This is very dependent on the laws that are in place in different states and even in different municipalities. This creates problems. So unlike QBS, where there is a national law, a national sort of benchmark for states to follow, we don't have the same thing with unit price procurement. We need this, but we don't have it yet. And it's causing a lot of issues across the country. Third, it's an owner representative issue. What do I mean by that? Depending on who the owner representative is, can have a great impact as to whether people support this approach, whether they find issues with it. And this goes to differences between school districts, municipalities, et cetera. And the fourth, this is an ethics issue. I generally try and keep legal and all of these things separate, but ethics kind of cuts across all of these in that what is the ethical responsibility of the industry? Is it to look out for the owner? Is it to look out for the users? Is it to look out for the professionals? I would argue that ethically, as professionals, we have responsibility to look at all of them, depending on what, doesn't matter which side you're on, whether you're an owner or a consultant or a user, you should be concerned ultimately about life safety. And so that becomes ethics. So this is what makes this a complex issue. Let's dive in a little further. It also is an issue that goes across all elements of the timeline of a project. Qualifications, design development, construction. I'm going to touch on each of these, but you can see there's multiple issues within each one of these phases. So we're not just talking about procurement at the beginning of a project. We're actually talking about how projects run, how they're developed, and what actually gets done. So let's dive into this a little bit. Qualifications. So procurement, when we get into this cooperative purchasing agreements and that are based on unit price, a lot of this is always about national best price. Many of the interviews that we did and people we talked to, the reason they gave for why they chose this approach was they're guaranteed a national best price. Well, that's true if you're in a very, very high priced market. You're in California, New York City, Chicago. The majority of the country, though, and we see this through lawsuits, through documents that have been presented, the national best price is actually higher than what could be obtained if it went out to a bidding process. So the mythology about this type of procurement and cooperative purchasing groups, that getting the national best price is a benefit, is not really true for most jurisdictions. The second, selection. This is all about you have a pre-qualified list. It is not very clear, nor is there much desire to make it clear who gets on, what specific criteria were put in place to have that list. The lack of transparency is creating an equity issue. And complaints that we see in many jurisdictions are focused on this is supposed to be a procurement process that allows anybody to be involved, when in reality, the qualifications process actually eliminates the opportunity for many companies to get involved. The third part is specifications. There is a real concern out there, especially by professionals, by their suppliers, that because of the relationships between procurement officers and suppliers, that the materials being specified are actually inappropriate. They're not only inappropriate, they are focused on a single supplier. Essentially, it's a sole source qualification or specification. So the three things in qualifications, they're getting best price, being the most qualified on a list, they're specifying, all of those are problematic and all of those are leading to legal issues. The second phase, design development. The key issue here really is this question of at what point does the project scope require an independent consultant with specific expertise? And this was a real point of contention that we experienced through these cases that we studied, people that we talked to, is when they're talking about needing independent expertise. If there is not code or general legal requirement in the jurisdiction, there's almost too much leeway in this, too much discretion. And it becomes a question of, well, what does one person interpret as a repair versus another person focus on, well, this is rehabilitation. One person says this is a complete redesign. Another person says this is just a modification. We are lacking clear guidance, and we are getting definitely into a life safety issue here. The second goes hand in hand, product specifications. The lack of independent oversight in many cases is leading to materials being required and selected for projects that are significantly over what's required, 2 and 3 times over what's required. So when you combine that with, well, you're getting a better building at a good national price, we have to look at where's the line being crossed of overspecification. And we saw this numerous times through interviews that we had. The third, we get to the construction phase. The construction phase, again, creates its own series of problems. The one that's perhaps most troubling is this lack of involvement by building departments in many jurisdictions. We had several interviews where individuals discussed building departments weren't even aware that this project was going on. It didn't meet their requirement to be notified. Well, these projects were going on completely unsupervised, right? There was no permitting that was being done. There were problems in many cases. There's reported cases of failures because of that. We can't have this ambiguous line as to what actually needs to be approved by a building department. This is causing problems. And the fact that somebody, just because somebody's qualified doesn't mean that it works. The second is the lack of code guidance. We saw big differences between, say, Florida, which has very tight building codes, and places, for example, in the middle of the country, which were much more lax. And cooperative purchasing agreements really take advantage of this because of the lack of building code agreement. They can classify things much easier in terms of, we're looking for repair projects. They're looking for, we're going to have a one-stop easy shop where the supplier does the supply and the engineering, which is perfectly fine in some instances. But the lack of code requirement opens this up even broader than it should be. So again, we see ambiguity. So when we put this together, we see multiple issues. One, it's a multi-phase problem. Concerns range from pre-project qualification to final construction. There's not just one issue here. Overriding issue, unit price procurement, cooperative purchasing agreements, they're not achieving what they set out to do. Lack of independent oversight by professionals is creating life safety concern. I think this is the place you're going to see more and more potential lawsuits occurring. Third, lack of transparency in vendor selection, equity, access, appropriateness. This is going to continue to grow as a concern. There's no other way around it. It's going to continue as a concern. The focus on creating easy selection processes. It leads to increased prices in most jurisdictions. potentially inappropriate product specifications. Easy does not mean the equivalent of appropriate. Easy doesn't mean the equivalent of best value of the project. And it certainly is not equivalent to best price. Now, should we always be thinking of things on price? Not always, obviously. But if we're only focusing on what's the easiest, pick something from a list. We're not talking about buying copy paper, right? And unfortunately, many of the interviewees that we had said very similar things. Procurement officers are being told by different entities that are promoting cooperative purchasing agreements that purchasing services such as roofing, cladding, insulation, there isn't really a difference between this and copy paper. And that's leading to an increase in this use. And we all know the fact is, this is not copy paper, this is life safety. And that was ultimately what we found in this study, is that this approach is growing because there's a misunderstanding of what happens if you treat these professional services in the same way that you treat a commodity. It's not a commodity, it's expertise. So what happens next? And with that, I'll let Brian, I'm going to bring Brian in to talk about what IBEC is focusing on going forward. There we go. Brian?
Paul, thank you very much, and I appreciate that great presentation. I have heard it a couple of times, and I thank you for that. Let me share my screen, if it will let me. There we go. All right, and thank you everybody for being here today. And I want to thank Sid and the RCI IBEC Foundation Board for funding this study and hiring Paul and Gordon to do this. I think they came up with some interesting work that we are going to be able to utilize as we try to educate procurement officials around the country and in Canada about the need to follow the rules and think about the way they procure design services a little bit differently than the way they procure copier paper. Thought that was a good example, Paul. First, and I'm just going to walk through what we see as IBEC as our 5 core areas that we're going to focus on from a public policy standpoint, moving forward as we go to the federal government, to state governments, to local governments, to provincial governments, and educate them about the need to do better procurement of design services. Number one is this idea that the design professional should be independent. Some of what we've seen as we've seen some of these cooperative procurements and other procurements is sort of a meshing and a merging of all of the folks on a job site. And I'm not sure that that's the right way to do business with regard to design. And so what we're trying to do is separate out the teams, if you will, from the standpoint of the independence of design consultants to come up with solutions to problems on behalf of the owner. And also with the idea that there should not be financial interests in the product specified or installed on those publicly funded projects. So that rule number one, if you will, or goal number one is to, again, make sure that there are independent design consultants with no financial interest in the product specified and installed on those publicly funded projects. And I would like to just point out that most of our work is focused on public procurements. Those are the procurements where our tax dollars are being used to to fix and upgrade infrastructure that is owned by the public sector. Number two, public health and safety. I think Paul spent a good amount of time on this, and I would echo his concerns. Those independent design professionals have a responsibility not only to adhere to local building codes and design standards, but also most of them as licensed professionals have a core purpose, which is public health and safety. For this alone, we don't believe that construction and design services should be part of unit price procurement. Third, Paul touched on this briefly, but I think this is a very important point. IBEC recommends strongly that we should avoid the idea of single source specifications. IBEC recommends that multiple material sources be specified in all publicly funded construction projects. This is what's going to do in part to promote competition and ensure the best value not only for the owner, but for the public. A specification that is focused on performance goals and life cycle cost goals will allow for increased competition between all material suppliers and construction partners. Fourth is this idea of requiring full and open competition. This is a hallmark of public procurements and has been for well over, I'm sure, 100 years. I don't go quite back that far, but it goes back a long time, the idea that there is a full and open competition. We encourage all public entities to embrace this concept of open competition and procurement to the maximum extent possible. Competition at each step in the process ensures the best designers and properly specified products are going to be used in the project to benefit owners and taxpayers. And our fifth point is really sort of one that maybe could have been the first point, but we made it the fifth point, is that the qualifications-based selection should be utilized for the procurement of design services. QBS, as it's known, has been around for over 50 years. In fact, it celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2022 at the federal level in the United States. Over 40 states utilize QBS and many more municipalities. It is part of the ABA's procurement guidelines, if you will, the American Bar Association's procurement guidelines. And the basic concept for those of you that may not know it is that when you're dealing with engineering services and design services, what you're focused on is the most qualified individual to provide the solution for your project. And that because those engineering and design services are a modest amount generally of a product, of a construction process, of a project, that the idea of getting the most qualified individuals to solve your problem is the most important part of that solution. Paul mentioned a study, or I think Sid mentioned the study that Paul had done previously. There's a link to that on the IBEC website that went live a little while ago. But the fact is QBS has been working well and effectively for the last 50 years and will continue to do so. And hence the reason why we think that this is one way to focus our efforts, which is getting the most qualified design professional on the job site. So those are our top five, and I would just pause for 1 second. Any of you that have questions, you are more than welcome to put those questions in the chat box. I know there was at least one there during Paul's presentation, and we will get to those questions at the end, and I'm almost finished in my presentation. But just if you have questions, please drop those in the chat box. And a little bit about what our actions will be moving forward. The first thing is we're going to continue and ramp up our efforts to engage with procurement officials on questionable procurements. We have seen a growing number of procurements where local governments or state governments are not exactly following their own rules that they already have set up. And we'd like to remind those local officials, and we have been doing that their job one is to follow the law. And we will continue to do that. And we have found some success in that in the times that we've been doing that in the last 6 months. We will also continue to oppose legislation to expand cooperative procurement as it relates to public procurements, especially when it comes to design services. Again, our focus is design services and the coupling of those things with the other parts of the construction project. And then finally, we will work to continue to protect QBS from legislative and regulatory threats. We encountered a few of those last year and were able to educate some legislators and regulatory officials and stop the process of harming the qualifications-based selection in a couple of states. Those are our actions moving forward. You will see more work from IBEC being done on this at all levels of government, and not only in the United States, but also in Canada. I want to thank you for your time today. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. Rick at the beginning had a website for the foundation where you can get the report. You saw that at the beginning, and the page that we have here, ibec.org/procurement, is where you can find a variety of resources on what we're doing in relationship to procurement. There's a link to the foundation's report there, as well as some other materials that we've put together. And with that, I'm going to hit my next slide, which is just to thank you all for attending. And we will take some questions. I know there was one question up front. And Sid, I think I'm turning it back to you now to manage the question part of our session today.
All right, the first question we have, Sid, Brian, and Paul, would be, were cooperatives surveyed in the study, and were suppliers that have cooperative contracts surveyed as well? And I think the overriding question is was this biased against all cooperative purchasing, or is it more specific? Kind of, what is the flavor there?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that's great to lead this off. Yes, we did interview owners that were currently using cooperative. We interviewed suppliers that have those contracts, and when done, I was going to say when done well, that's a bad way of saying this. There were cases where it was working well. Typically when there wasn't a lot of ambiguity around things. So in Florida, there were several that we interviewed that it worked well because everyone knew exactly what they were working with, what the requirements were. Where it's the less the sort of guardrails, the more gray and the more issues that came out. But yes, we interviewed both people inside, outside, so we got a broad sense of what worked and what didn't.
All right, thank you very much. I'm reading this next question, so let me ask it of the three of you again. It comes out of the real Arissa Cooper, who seems to be populated quite frequently on our list due to a glitch in the matrix. The question is, how do you deal with a QBS selected consultant, but the public owner says they want to use a specific cooperative vendor who generates the spec and provides it to the bidders, even when the consultant points out the issues with the design and the lack of details? What are your recommendations there?
I guess I would say, I mean, I think this goes back to it's not my, IBEC's recommendation number one, which is this concept that there needs to be an independent design professional involved. And the fact that a design professional is on the job, we should allow them to use their abilities as a design professional to come up with those solutions. And having ended my thought on that, I want to bring Sid in as a design professional, not as a member of the foundation board, or as Paul as an engineering professor, with some thoughts on that. And we have an architect and an engineer who can give their thoughts.
I think you need to fall back on two issues there, not as arguments, but as points to of education. The first is that on the first page of most building codes, whether they're national codes, state codes, it says that the codes are intended for the protection of the health, safety, and welfare of the occupants of the public. And so I think having a qualified person to interpret the codes, and then secondly, to be responsible for their actions, for their design, for the end product, I think that's where the argument has to occur. It's difficult to talk to an owner that doesn't have a lot of understanding how codes work and how and what the codes require in the way of professionals to administer those codes. But I think that's where you're going to have to start with a lot of the arguments, so to speak.
All right, thank you very much, Sid. Jim Corcoran asks, hi, it has become the concept that is well used, and I'm guessing he means cooperative purchasing is a concept that is being used in many states and is growing. Is there something that would need to be overturned at the state level with procurement law changes? I guess this would be to Brian mostly.
I think the short answer is yes. And Jim, we'd need to know more about what state. I know, for example, in the state of Virginia, there were some changes made to exclude cooperatives from engaging in public infrastructure projects, for example. And that's, again, I'll just, so it's clear to everyone, our concern with cooperative purchasing is not if someone's buying laptops or copiers, it's when people are buying design services. And so it's not to exclude cooperative purchasing from a state's ability to get school desks or things like that. So Jim, if you want to talk offline, you can find us on the website and shoot John or I an email, and we'd be glad to talk to you about that.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. I'm not going to ask about specific lawsuits that are out there, but a more general question to Paul and Brian. How does UPP and cooperative purchasing undermine competition? And what does that mean for the taxpayer? Really, at the end of the day, what does that mean for the taxpayer?
No, I'll go and I'll let Brian take the end of it. In the end, what we found was it has two key elements, I think, that the taxpayers should be concerned about. One, they're not necessarily getting the best price for a project. It's costing them more money. The other is they're not necessarily getting full access to who may be qualified to do the project. And that's just leading to less and less competition. And those are both things that ultimately hurt the taxpayer.
I mean, I would simply add, I think when you limit the competition, whether it's by limiting what is in a specification or limiting the number of people who can engage in offering their services, even using qualifications-based selection, you're generally going to increase the price of those services. And in some regards, one of the roles of a public procurement is to safeguard taxpayer resources. This is an instance where we want to make sure we do that. And in some ways, we want to make sure we have, from a design perspective, the best solution for the municipality or state government that is procuring the building enclosure project that they need to do. And I will answer one question that's in the middle up there, John, as the last one, which is, did the survey address the selection of design build construction projects? I think I'll ask Paul that, but just as an aside or as a yes and to Paul's answer, is that in many states there is a process for, and there is at the federal government, to do a QBS, what I'll call a QBS compliant design build project. And that's merely looking at the qualifications of the offers before you look at the price on the project. As you know, when you submit that design build project, it's all wrapped up, the design and the construction. And again, there's ways to do that, and we would simply support those ways in to do it. The law at the federal government was passed in the mid-90s, and lots of states have followed suit when they've done their design build projects.
Yeah, I think Brian answered that very well. We did talk about design build in a few cases, but it really is almost separate in most jurisdictions from everything else that was talked about, such as roofing, et cetera, because it is guided by some specific procurement depending on the size of the project. So yes, we did, but in most cases, design build was separate, just in the way that it's addressed legally within different states.
I would like to encourage everyone to get a copy of the report. Paul did a really good job at summarizing what was in the report, but when you really get into it page by page, there are a lot more details, a lot more substantiating background information, a lot more facts and figures that I think anyone can use in their negotiation or their efforts regarding procurement. So take some time, look at it. It's an outstanding survey, outstanding interviews, and an outstanding report. And I think it's going to go a long way toward giving the industry now the information, the documented information, research that's required to make some significant progress in procurement reform.
Sid, thanks to everyone for being here today. Thank you for hosting us, Sid, and doing a great job. Paul, thank you for the great report. There will be more to follow on the IBEC website and in interface.
On behalf of the foundation, thank you to everyone.